Hey guys, so today we're going to be doing our last lesson of this chapter. So this is going to finish off the kind of ecosystem portion of this year. Today we're going to be looking at how ecosystems change over time. So for this lesson on ecosystem changes, we're going to describe how terrestrial ecosystems are altered by human activity, like forestry practices and fire. We're also going to talk about the process of eutrophication, which is one of the big ways that aquatic ecosystems change over time. Then we're also going to be looking at sources of water pollution and ways that we can measure water quality. So gradual changes in ecosystems do occur naturally as biotic and abiotic factors shift and fluctuate. Natural events can also cause rapid changes like fires, floods, volcanic activity, asteroid impacts, etc. And these major natural events are less common than they used to be. We used to, when Earth was young, have a lot of volcanic eruptions take place. We used to have more asteroid impacts when we were closer to when the solar system had formed. Floods used to be more common. Sorry, not floods. Fire used to be more common just because we didn't use as many fire suppression tactics. Floods are the one thing that didn't used to be more common. Those are in some areas becoming more common. Human activities can cause both immediate changes, like when you destroy a habitat, or more gradual changes, like with climate change. Forests are really important because of their impact on both like the composition of the atmosphere as well as things like the water cycle. Forests are responsible for a big portion of the water cycle, especially in like rainforests where they move water out of the soil and into the atmosphere via transpiration. Areas that are near deforested rainforests tend to experience desertification, which is desert formation, due to the lack of transpiration. Now that the rainforests are gone, there's less transpiration, which means that there's less water in the atmosphere to condense and then precipitate down. So there's less precipitation. That's why you have these deserts forming. Forests also obviously remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which helps decrease that level of greenhouse gas, also adds oxygen into the atmosphere. We've also talked about the fact that forests decrease erosion and runoff by protecting the soil with its canopies and also holding the soil in place with its roots. And then forests also help maintain nutrient levels in the soil by preventing things like runoff. Human activities can have major impacts on terrestrial ecosystems. About a third of Earth's forests have been cut down for either agriculture or urbanization, just making room for like cities and stuff like that, which alters the water cycle. You're going to have less water absorbed from the soil into the trees and therefore less water for transpiration. It's going to increase erosion, also destroying shelters, nesting sites, food, all of that kind of stuff for the animals that have a habitat in that forest. So we're going to look at the three main types of forestry practices and some of the pros and cons, where they would be used and why, that sort of thing. So the first is the slash and burn type of forestry, which is most common in tropical areas where you're clearing the rainforest for agriculture. This is when large areas of the forest are completely cleared by cutting down all the trees, and then you kind of bulldoze all of the fallen trees together and burn them. The point of doing this, of burning the trees, is because in the rainforest, the soil there is actually fairly low in nutrients because you have these huge trees, very high density trees, that have taken all of the nutrients into them. And so the nutrients are in the trees, not in the soil. And so for agriculture, you need the soil to have nutrients in it. And by burning the trees, you return those nutrients to the soil, at least for a short period of time. Big downside of this, it's not very sustainable. It is the worst for the environment. But when you have places you know, that don't have a lot of, you know, other options for people in like more developing countries and stuff like that, it might really be the only option for them. Then you have clear cutting, which is when all of the trees in an area are cut down and used for timber or pulp. This is the most cost-effective method of getting wood products. It's cheaper than the next one we're going to look at. In Canada, clear cutting is usually followed by replanting whatever the dominant species or whatever the most valuable tree in that area was. Clear cutting is also a method that can be used to get rid of invasive species or diseases that are affecting the trees in that area. If you find an infected tree, you need to cut down not only that tree, but all of the trees in like a given diameter in order to prevent it from spreading to the entire forest. The downsides of clear cutting are that it does increase erosion and runoff in that area, also decreases biodiversity, and it increases the risk of invasive species and invasive diseases because you're opening up a new niche in the middle of your forest. And then the last one is selective cutting. This is when just certain trees are cut down and removed from an area. So you just kind of go and pick a couple trees from that area to cut down. The rest of the trees are left to regenerate the area. The downside is that it is more costly than clear cutting, but the bonus is that the environmental impacts are limited because the trees that remain are able to maintain the biodiversity, prevent erosion, keep the water cycle going, that sort of thing. Okay, fire is often an important and even beneficial instrument of change in an ecosystem. Fire ensures that the ecosystems contain a variety of plant types and not just the climax community. It essentially makes sure that you maintain biodiversity in your ecosystem. Naturally occurring fires are needed to maintain healthy forest ecosystems. If you suppress fires in an area for too long, you're going to just have a climax community form, which is actually fairly low biodiversity, which makes that ecosystem less stable over time. So fire prevention methods have been harmful to ecosystems, but they used to be a very, very common practice. Now they're more so just used when human settlements are at risk, as opposed to like anywhere in the boreal forest. Prescribed burns are now also sometimes used where fires are intentionally started and then controlled so that they don't just, you know, take off in order to help maintain healthy ecosystems and also protect human interests, because if you don't have those prescribed burns, you have a buildup of flammable material as like trees die and their leaves fall off and stuff like that. And it actually makes it more likely to have a really devastating fire if you are preventing fires for too long. Okay, let's move over to aquatic ecosystems now. Once again, because we live in a landlocked province, we are going to be focusing on lakes. And there's two main types of lakes in terms of how lakes change. So you have oligotrophic lakes and eutrophic lakes. Oligotrophic lakes are deep, cold, and clear. They have very low levels of nutrients, which limits their autotroph populations, which therefore limits anything that eats autotrophs. The low nutrient level and low levels of autotrophs is what causes the lake to look really, really clear. And then eutrophic lakes are shallow, they're warm, they're murky because they have a lot of nutrients and therefore a lot of autotrophs floating around in them. And all oligotrophic lakes will eventually turn into eutrophic lakes. That is the process of eutrophication, which is a natural process where over time, deep, cold, clear lakes become shallower and warmer, and they build up nutrients and they become murky and all of that stuff. Eventually, that process even continues past the eutrophic lakes, and you just get a dry lake bed where there used to be water and there's not anymore. And that's because those eutrophic lakes will eventually have all their water evaporate, and you will have sediment building up the bottom of the lake. But that happens over hundreds of or thousands of years when it's happening naturally. So this is just kind of an example of what this would look like. At the top here, we have our oligotrophic lake. It's deep, it would be very cold, it would be very clear, and you wouldn't have a very large variety of species. And as you can see, very little autotrophs, very little plant life. At the bottom here, we would have a very eutrophic lake. It's shallow, it would be very warm, there's lots of plant life here. And then in the middle, this is a lake that is undergoing the eutrophic process. It's becoming eutrophic. So yeah, there are a couple human impacts on this process of eutrophication. One is runoff. So again, when we're talking about eutrophication, we're talking about a lake getting warmer, more nutrient rich, and shallower. So runoff from agriculture, from household products, that kind of stuff, is going to add both things like animal waste and fertilizers into the water, both of which are nutrient rich. So you're going to have an increase in the amount of nutrients in the lake as there is more runoff, which means that there are more nutrients available for autotrophs. And so the level of autotrophs in that lake is going to go up. Runoff also carries soil into the lake, so does like erosion from the banks of the lake. So if we're like removing trees and planting grass and stuff like that to make a nice like lawn on the lakefront, that's going to increase the rate of erosion and runoff into the lake as well, which increases the rate of sedimentation. So your lake is getting shallower faster as sediment builds up faster on the bottom. And then global warming also speeds up the eutrophication process by just warming up the water and increasing the rate that the water evaporates from. That would also increase the rate at which oxygen is leaving the lake, because remember, warm water holds less oxygen. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is some of the different ways that we pollute water, some of the different categories of water pollution. So organic solid waste includes things like sewage. This solid waste tends to be broken down by bacteria in the water, which uses up oxygen. So the more organic solid waste that's present, the less oxygen you tend to end up with in your water. Then you have disease-causing organisms, which come from both human and animal waste that get into the water, usually because of runoff. And then these microorganisms can cause disease outbreaks for any species that drink the water. So things like E. coli outbreaks and stuff like that. Then we have inorganic solids and dissolved minerals. Those include things like fertilizers, like road salt, which I don't think you guys use road salt in Alberta, but lots of places do. In Ontario, we do, in a lot of places. Also, things like mining can also cause these inorganic solids to move into the lakes. And with a lot of these compounds, they can bioaccumulate. So they're toxic to organisms and they can build up in those organisms over time. Number 4, we have thermal energy, which is just heat energy. Again, heat is considered a form of pollution for these lakes when it's occurring unnaturally, because as the water heats up, there's less oxygen in that water. As there's less oxygen in that water, it means that fewer organisms can be supported by that water. So it's going to decrease the biodiversity, decrease the size of the different populations. This thermal energy can come from different industries that are like dumping into the water, or from electricity producing industries. And then the fifth type of water pollution is organic compounds, which includes things like oil and pesticides, which are also toxic, also bioaccumulate like the inorganic solids and dissolved minerals. It also includes things like detergent, which can cause algal blooms, which, as we've talked about before, decrease oxygen levels when the algae dies and decomposes. So of these different types of water pollution, we have two that can bioaccumulate, number 3 and number 5. And then we also have number 4, number 5, and number 1, which can all decrease the oxygen availability in the water. So there's some overlap between kind of their impacts. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at are some of the water quality indicators, which is just how we determine if the water quality is good enough, especially for like human consumption. Acceptable water quality does vary depending on its intended use. So obviously, like drinking water is going to have a much higher acceptable water quality than something that's just going to be used for like industrial purposes. There are 3 main indicators of water quality. The first is bacteria count. It's really difficult and really expensive to test for disease-causing bacteria, but there is something called coliform bacteria, which occurs naturally in the intestine of both humans and other animals, and it's really easy and cheap to test for that bacteria. Now, coliform bacteria isn't dangerous at all, but if you find it in a water sample, it means that animal waste or human waste has polluted that water. And since many dangerous disease-causing bacteria are transmitted in human and animal waste, if the coliform is present, it means that you probably have more dangerous bacteria also present. So we're testing for the coliform bacteria to see if the other bacteria are present. We don't really care about the coliform bacteria itself. The second is dissolved oxygen content. Lakes that are cooler and lakes that have less pollutants tend to have higher oxygen levels. If you have warmer lakes, they can hold less oxygen. If you have more pollutants dissolved in your lake, that's taking up spaces that could dissolve oxygen, so those also have less dissolved oxygen. There are a couple different like chemical solutions that you can react with water to determine the oxygen levels. Essentially, the chemicals react and bind with the oxygen, and the more oxygen present, the greater the color change you will see in the water. And the type of and number of fish can also indicate oxygen levels. Healthy trout indicate really high oxygen levels because they need a lot of oxygen to thrive. Carp and catfish don't need a lot of oxygen to survive. So if you have a lot of them present in your lake, you probably have fairly low oxygen levels in that lake. And if there's no fish, it could indicate that there are very low oxygen levels, so low that it can't support any fish life. Though it's not like completely indicative, because it could also indicate a lake that just has like a really low pH or something. And then the last indicator of water quality is something called biological oxygen demand, or BOD for short. The BOD is the amount of dissolved oxygen needed by decomposers to totally break down the organic matter in a water sample at 20 degrees over 5 days. Now, you don't need to know all of that. I don't care if you know the temperature or the 5 days thing. All you need to know is that the BOD is essentially how much oxygen is required by the decomposers. Essentially, it's used to indicate the amount of organic matter in the water. As you have more organisms in the ecosystem, the biological oxygen demand is going to go up. The more things that are there in the ecosystem and using oxygen, the more the oxygen demand is. If lakes are cooler and therefore less productive and have fewer autotrophs and stuff like that, you're going to have a lower BOD. So your oligotrophic lakes tend to have a low BOD. And then more productive lakes that have lots of organisms are going to have a higher BOD. It is important to note that BOD, biological oxygen demand, and oxygen levels are inversely proportionate to one another. The higher the biological oxygen demand, that means the more oxygen is being used up, so the lower the oxygen level. If you have a very low biological oxygen demand, that means your oxygen isn't being used up, so the actual oxygen level will be higher. Okay, so that's what this is talking about. As BOD increases, the amount of dissolved oxygen decreases. They are inversely proportional to one another. This is a big problem when excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus end up in your lakes, because it's going to promote a big growth of different populations of autotrophs like algae, which then builds up the amount of decaying matter, and then the decomposers use up all the oxygen. So following that influx of nutrients into your lake and following the algal bloom, the BOD shoots up, which is why the oxygen plummets, which then results in the suffocation and death of organisms like fish and stuff that need oxygen in the water to survive. Once everything has decomposed and the decomposition has ended, then the BOD will come back down again and the oxygen levels will go back up. So this is a negative feedback loop. It will eventually sort itself out and get itself back to normal as long as the nutrients stop going into the lake. But you have to hope that that happens before all the fish die. Human land use around lakes, like putting in cottages or homes on the lake shore, has increased the rate of eutrophication, essentially because of things like runoff and erosion increasing the rate of sedimentation. Human activities that increase lake salinity or pollute the lake in any way is going to affect the levels of oxygen. Anytime you get rid of trees and replace them with either lawns or beaches, that is also going to increase the rate of erosion, which again makes the lakes shallower because of sedimentation. Runoff also increases the rate of decomposition, which is going to essentially cause a buildup of organic matter, which becomes part of the soil. That also makes them shallower. So there's lots of different factors that lead to this eutrophication process in our lakes. And then once you have a lot of sediment building up in the lake bed, your lake becomes shallower, and shallower lakes heat up faster, which also means less oxygen can be dissolved. Global warming obviously also contributes to lakes heating up faster, also increases the rate of evaporation, all of these things making lakes more shallow. So just to kind of summarize, runoff, erosion, both increase the rates of sedimentation, pollution, global warming, thermal energy pollution, anything that's going to put stuff onto the lake bed, which makes it shallower, or that's going to warm up your water, is all going to cause eutrophication. Okay, that is it for this chapter. We're not done this unit yet. The next chapter is going to be all about evolution.